Something was already going horribly wrong before I even understood what I was seeing. Chainsaws were screaming through my backyard like nothing was under control anymore. I ran outside and froze when I saw the tree shaking violently, splitting at its core. Someone was shouting to get back, but the noise drowned everything, even my own thoughts. Then I heard her voice calm, satisfied, like she had planned every second of it. And that's when I realized Karen wasn't stopping anything, she was causing all of it. The ground trembled as the tree finally gave up, leaning toward the wrong side. I remember the sound, most wood cracking, metal twisting, and someone screaming for help. It all happened in seconds, but it felt like the world was collapsing in slow motion. Nothing about this was accidental, and by the time I understood it, it was already too late. I used to think my home was the one place where nothing could be taken from me. It sat at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, where mornings felt slow, warm, and predictable. The house wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and that alone gave it meaning. Behind it stood a tree that had been there long before I ever moved in, 100 years old, wide, rooted deep, and silently holding the ground together like it belonged to the earth itself. I didn't think of it as property or decoration, but more like something alive that protected everything around it. It cooled the yard in summer, softened the wind in winter, and made every morning feel a little easier to breathe. I never imagined that something so peaceful could become the center of a war I didn't see coming. Back then, life felt simple, and I believed nothing in this neighborhood could ever turn against me, especially not the people who smiled at me every morning while quietly waiting for a reason to complain about something that was never theirs. Before Karen ever became a problem, she was just another neighbor who blended into the background, the kind you barely noticed until everything changed. But the moment she was voted in as HOA president, something in her shifted. It didn't happen overnight in reality, but it felt that way in how quickly the tone of the neighborhood changed. Meetings that used to be about small updates turned into lectures about order and standards, and somehow, everything started circling back to control. My property, especially the tree, became her favorite obsession. It was strange watching someone treat authority like it was a personal upgrade instead of a responsibility. She began speaking like rules didn't apply unless she approved them, rewriting interpretations of bylaws that didn't even cover my land. The more people pushed back, the more convinced she became that she was right. That was the part that made it uncomfortable. She didn't just want agreement, she needed obedience. I remember the first time she looked at my backyard without even saying hello, her eyes locking onto that tree as it had personally insulted her. From that moment, it stopped being about rules. It became personal for her, even if I hadn't done anything at all. It started with a single letter, neatly placed in my mailbox, as if it carried authority just because it was printed on expensive paper. There was no greeting, no discussion, only a demand that my tree be removed within an impossible time frame. I remember reading it twice, not because it was confusing, but because it felt unreal. My property wasn't even under the HOA. And she knew that, or at least she should have. I responded calmly at first. I gathered the documents, the legal records, the property lines. Everything that clearly showed her jurisdiction ended long before it reached my fence. I expected that to end it, but Karen didn't deal in endings that didn't go her way. A second notice arrived, then a third, each one more aggressive than the last. The tone shifted from formal to personal, like the tree itself was offending her sense of control. I wrote back again, more firmly this time, attaching proof and referencing actual regulations. It didn't matter. Facts weren't entering her thinking, they were just things she ignored. What surprised me wasn't her persistence, but her refusal to even acknowledge reality. It was like arguing with someone who had already decided the truth didn't matter if it didn't serve her. And that's when I realized this wasn't about paperwork anymore. It was about power. The tree had been there long before any of this ever mattered. Long before HOA meetings. Long before rules written on paper. Long before Karen decided she had a voice that should control everyone else. It was over 100 years old, rooted deep into the ground as it belonged more to the land than to any property line. When the wind came through, it didn't shake it, absorbed it, steady and calm, like it had seen every storm this place could ever offer. I never thought of it as just a tree. It was shade in the summer when the heat pressed down too hard. It was quiet in the mornings when everything else still felt asleep. And it was stability in a world that kept trying to change things that didn't need changing. It wasn't decoration, it was balance. But Karen saw it differently. To her, it wasn't nature. It was defiance. Something unapproved, unregulated, unaligned with her idea of order. And the more I protected it, the more it seemed to irritate her. It stopped being part of the landscape in her mind and became a problem she needed to fix, like its existence was a challenge she couldn't ignore anymore. Chainsaws were the first thing I heard before I even saw what was happening. That low, aggressive roar cutting through the air didn't belong in my yard. Not without permission, not without warning, not without anything legal backing it. I rushed forward and felt my stomach drop when I saw strangers already inside the fence line, working like they had every right to be there. Karen was standing a few steps away, arms crossed, watching it all like she was overseeing something routine. No hesitation, no uncertainty, just that same controlled expression, like consequences didn't apply to her. The tree was already being attacked. Deep cuts carved into its trunk, wood shaking with every bite of the saw. It hadn't even been fully understood what they were doing yet. But it was already too late to pretend this was harmless. I shouted for them to stop. My voice barely carried over the machinery, but I kept moving forward anyway, pulling out my phone as fast as I could. I told them they had no legal permission, no clearance, nothing that justified what they were doing. One of the workers hesitated for a second, but Karen's voice cut through instantly, sharper than the chainsaws, telling them to continue. That was the moment everything stopped feeling like a disagreement and started feeling like something crossing a line it could never come back from. The moment it finally gave way, everything slowed down in a way I can still feel when I think about it. The tree didn't fall the way anyone expected it to. It didn't tilt toward my yard, and it didn't collapse into the open space they must have assumed was safe. Instead, it shifted in the opposite direction, heavy and unstoppable, like it had chosen its own path in those final seconds. At first, there was confusion. The workers froze mid-step, realizing too late that something was wrong. Then the sound hit deep cracking, like the earth itself was splitting open. The tree moved with terrifying weight, bending the air around it as it came down toward Karen's property. I remember seeing her face change in real time, the confidence draining out before she even had time to react. When it hit, the impact wasn't just loud, it erased everything else. Wood shattered, glass exploded outward, and the structure beneath it gave in like it was never meant to resist something that massive. Dust rose instantly, swallowing the scene whole, and then, for a brief moment after, there was nothing. No shouting, no machines, no commands. Just a silence so heavy it felt unreal, like the world itself was waiting to see what would happen next. The silence didn't last long, before it was replaced by chaos again, but this time it was different. Real panic, real urgency, sirens cutting through the air as emergency crews rushed into the scene. Neighbors who had been watching in disbelief now stepped back, realizing this was no longer just property damage. It was something heavier. Karen was no longer in control of anything. She was shouting at first, trying to direct people like she still had authority, but no one was listening anymore. That power she clung to so tightly had completely disappeared in seconds. Then came the moment everything shifted, when her voice broke mid-sentence as responders pulled her son from the wreckage. The seriousness in their movements said everything before anyone spoke. One child was brought out shaken but conscious. The other came out on a stretcher, motionless, as medical teams worked urgently around him. The atmosphere changed instantly. What had started as anger and conflict was now replaced with something far more difficult to process. For the first time, Karen wasn't issuing demands. She was just standing there, watching, as reality finally caught up to her choices. The investigation moved quickly after that. Once the reports were filed and the evidence was reviewed, the picture became impossible to ignore. Unauthorized entry, illegal demolition work, ignored warnings, and decisions made without permits all stacked against Karen one by one. What she had called authority was reduced to paperwork violations and personal decisions that carried real consequences. The HOA distanced itself almost immediately, trying to separate its name from what had happened, but it didn't help. Lawsuits followed, fines accumulated, and her position as president was revoked without hesitation. The financial weight of it all hit harder than anything she had ever tried to enforce on others, and there was no committee meeting she could hold to undo it. For me, there was no celebration in it, just a quiet understanding of how far things had gone from something that should have never escalated. Weeks later, I stood in my yard as a new tree was planted under proper supervision, smaller but stable, rooted carefully into the same ground. And for the first time, there was peace where all that control once tried to be. And that's how everything unfolded from a single decision that was never meant to go that far. But now I want to hear from you. Do you think Karen's consequences were justified? Or did things cross a line that shouldn't have been crossed? Drop your thoughts in the comments because every perspective matters in a story like this. If you enjoyed this kind of real-life style drama, make sure to like and subscribe for more stories like this one.